Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the International Career Panel Annual Workshop and Panel Presentation. My name is Joe Hoff, and I'm the Director of the Office of Global Education and Engagement within the Office of International Programs. And I'm here to welcome everyone, both here in the room as well as those online. And please, anyone during either presentation, please post your questions that you may have in the Q&A box online, and those here in the audience, you can raise your hand as usual, right? So I'm just going to introduce Dr. Patrick Madsen, the Executive Director of the University Career Center, who's going to start us off with a workshop on targeting your international career. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everybody in person. Hi, good to see you. Look at those smiles. Even I see the smiles with your masks on, too. That's so fantastic. Hello, everybody in the virtual world. We wish you were here physically with us, but next year, I know you will be. My name's Patrick Madsen. I'm with the Career Center, and my job for the next 4 to 5 hours, right, Joe? No? Okay, just 25 minutes, 20 minutes, I think, because we'll have some question and answer, is to talk about how you can target a global career. And so I've been doing this for a long time, about 20 years, working with students who say, I want to go overseas and I want to have a career overseas. And the first question that I always ask them is, why? And I think that's a very important thing to ask yourself, why? What is it about the international career that really interests you? Because when you start to discover what about you and what about that type of career path means to you, it'll help you plan a lot better. How you actually get there. Now, as we get our PowerPoint up, right, Chris? There we go. Is it up? There we go. So the first thing, aside from the why that we want to do, is to take a look at your brand. There we go. We'll get the slide deck. Don't we love technology? Is it working, Chris? Yes. No. Hello, people. So I'm going to keep talking as we keep figuring out the slides. So when we think about your idea, the three things that you need to think through as you're looking at that why and targeting your career, the first thing is just your brand. When employers are looking at you in terms of who you are as a candidate, there's two things that they're trying to figure out. One is, what do you offer me? So I'm going to invest in possibly hiring you, and you're from overseas. They have to make sure that the return on an investment is something that's going to be in their best interest. And then the second thing they're going to start looking at you around is, what are the types of competencies that you have that tell me that you're going to thrive in an international career? And so those are two things that in your brand you're going to need to be able to explain to employers. So when we think about the types of things that employers are looking for in terms of competencies, one, they're looking possibly for language skills. If you're going to be targeting yourself for a particular area around the globe, the language skill ability and the understanding of or the cultural awareness is going to be a big thing that you're going to need to be able to prove to them. This is how I can show you how I can speak the language, how I can understand the business customs, and those types of things. The second thing that you want to be able to demonstrate to them is your ability to move around and be agile and be able to be okay with the unknown. So I've traveled a lot over my career. I've worked overseas. And you can read a lot about the country, you can read a lot about the business practices, but until you get there and experience what it's actually like, everything from the metro to getting to your employer or dealing with any of the foreign taxes or anything like that, until you actually get to that point, you won't have the knowledge that you need. So employers are going to be looking for, on your brand, how can you describe to me that you have the language skills, you have the geographic experience, you have the agility, but more importantly, you have the skills to be able to do the job so that when they do hire you, they feel good about that hire. So with your brand, how you can get that kind of experience, how you can explain that experience to them is through three ways. One is on your resume. So when you are thinking about an international career, you have to prove to employers that you have the experience through internships, through study abroad, through volunteering, through joining student clubs and organizations that relate to the international world or function that you want to go into. You have to be able to show them on your resume that you've been there, done that in some way. That doesn't mean that you had to have worked overseas or anything like that, but they want to see that demonstration that you have an interest, you have the motivation to go and work overseas. They want to try to stay away from people who say, well, I want to work overseas because it just sounds cool to me. Like, that's great, Why don't you go travel for vacation first if it sounds cool to you? Because it's a whole different experience that you have for that as well. When you're thinking about some of the complications about working overseas that you might experience, the things that you need to pay attention to is, one, where you want to go, the economic conditions that might exist there, but also making sure that there's actually employment there. And so we have a lot of resources in this Career Center and this university that can help you with those targeting a little bit as well. So we're still working on the technology to make sure that the thing actually works. Go ahead and move forward. There you go. So marketing yourself on paper, resume, making sure that it's clearly shown to the employer what international experience that you have, what specific competencies as it relates to those types of jobs are clearly marked. When you think about LinkedIn and your social media, it needs to be there as well. One of the biggest resources out there is LinkedIn, to be able to find opportunity, to be able to describe that opportunity and the skill sets and the experiences that you have. And then finally, in person or through virtual interviews, you're going to have to double down and explain and show to those employers how you match that type of job and how you might do in their international career. So the second thing that you're going to want to think through is, if I have my brand, I know what I want to do. I have this functional knowledge. I have these kind of skills that everybody keeps saying that I need to have. I have these types of experiences. Now you have to target companies. Who's out there? And so when you think about some different ways that you can target companies, one, you can look at pure international companies. So when you start looking at the groupings of different organizations that exist around the world, the first group is purely international. So they don't have a presence in America, for example. It might be a French-owned company only in France, and that might be the company that you might want to target. So there's a lot of those types of companies. And I'm going to show you in a second where you can find some of this information and even job postings that are out there. And then you have this next category that's called the multinational companies. So these are the companies that maybe they're owned by America, maybe they're owned by France, maybe they're owned by whoever, but they have different branches or different subsidiaries, if you will, in multiple countries. So why this is important is because if you're here and you say, I want to eventually work in South Korea, well then you can find all the South Korean companies that actually exist in America and or American companies that have a branch in South Korea and start here. Because sometimes it's easier to start with a company in this country and then work your way in that company towards their offices or their overseas branch, if you will. So sometimes that makes it a little bit easier, especially when you think about work visas and things of that nature. And then, of course, you have a huge grouping of these non-governmental agencies, these nonprofits, these things like the United Nations and whatnot that are huge in terms of providing opportunities for students and candidates to go overseas. So the biggest resource that this university has that both the international programs and the Career Office funds is Going Global. So if you haven't been to either of our websites, go to Going Global, because this is a really good resource that gives you not just job and internship postings. So somebody in the audience asked, how do I find jobs? That's the number one place, and I'll show you a couple after that. And two, it gives you country guides. So maybe you determine and I want to figure out what type of industry actually exists there. It'll have a guide for you to help you understand job sites for the Chilean economy. It'll tell you about the industries that are there, and then it'll give you some really good information on work visas and how do you actually acclimate to that particular job world as well. So Going Global is going to be your number one resource. The second one is what we call AmCham. So you think about this. In this country, we have the Chamber of Commerce. What AmCham is the American Chamber of Commerce in name your country that you're trying to target. So one of the very first things that I would tell students to do when they're thinking about international careers is I say, where do you want to work? They say, Japan. I say, fantastic. Let's Google American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. And it starts giving you a list out of all the companies that are multinationals or internationals that are on that list. So at least it gives you a target list of companies that you can start thinking through. I think what happens a lot of times is when we search for jobs, we just like, any job out there. Well, the way you should be looking for jobs is figuring out, what am I trying to do? Here's the function that I want. Who does that kind of function or that type of thing? And then what are those companies that really interest me? And then go at them. Because not every single company is just going to post magically online. You have to come to them, especially when it's an international career where they're not just going to post it for anybody in the world. What they really want to try to find are those who are motivated to work for their company, and it could be overseas. So that's a very big thing. Again, it comes back to this idea of return on an investment. If an employer hires you, it's got to be worth it to them moving forward. We'll keep progressing forward. So Idealist.com, if any of you are looking for teaching overseas or nonprofits overseas, Idealist.com is going to be your #1 website that you should be looking at for a lot of those non-governmental types of things. It has a job search, volunteering, and internship search for around the world. And the biggest thing that I love about Idealist.com is that it can actually give you information on organizations that exist all around the world based on area of focus or topic of interest. So if you are interested in solving world hunger, you can use that as a topic to see what nonprofits, what NGOs exist in that space to start developing that target list of companies as well. And then another one, Uniworld, gives you an idea, again, similar to American Chamber of Commerce. It'll give you information on companies that exist in America that might be French-owned or vice versa, or name your country that's in there. One of the things that I've noticed in the Charlotte area, if I remember correctly, that there are like 250 German-owned companies in this area, just to give you an example. That's huge. And when you go up to the Greensboro area, it's even more diverse in terms of the types of multinational companies that exist. And so a lot of times people think, well, the only place I can find international work is in Miami or DC. Not true. They're all over the place. And sometimes we don't even realize the potential that exists in our own backyard. So again, NGOs, these can include embassies, world associations, United Nations. If you want to come into the Career Center, I can give you a whole list of fantastic UN types of organizations and other NGOs that exist that just start your mind thinking of some different options that might exist for you. And the third thing I want to bring up in the time that I have, I'm still good with time, right, Joe? Yeah. Okay, good. Love that. Is the resources. So when you think about the resources, the #1 thing that you might have out there is LinkedIn. Now, how many in the audience, raise your hand, and for those of you at home, put up a thumbs up. How many of you have LinkedIn profile? Yay. Okay. How many of you who've raised your hand like your LinkedIn profile and you feel confident in it? Love it. You're kind of okay? Okay. For those out there in the crowd, if you're thinking, oh gosh, I don't know, you need to make sure that you are confident in your LinkedIn profile. More than ever. So I started doing this stuff 20 plus years ago. I had long flowing hair when I first started, right? Joe, did you too? We both had a lot of hair when we don't anymore. With LinkedIn, this whole hidden job market, this whole idea of how do I meet people from around the world for potential global jobs, LinkedIn is the place. It's a fantastic opportunity for you not only to express your brand out there of this is me, this is what I want to do internationally, but you can find organizations to start targeting. And more importantly, people can know that you exist and have an understanding that you actually want to work overseas, and it creates that potential. And I'm going to say that LinkedIn is probably going to be the biggest resource, not just to find stuff, but to meet people and start talking to them. I think that this idea of, I want to work overseas, and it sounds sexy, and I have all the brands, I have the language skills, and how do I do it? Once you start letting the world know that you actually want to go over there, it will provide you opportunity. It's about talking to people, because a lot of these things that you have to be able to dig out, and they're a little hidden because people are afraid sometimes to just hire random people from around the world without some sort of relationship or understanding of who you are as a person. A couple other websites that I throw out there, and there's many others out there, and when you meet with your career coach, we can go dig a little bit deeper on it. One of my favorites is DevX, is international development type of website. A lot of times people don't realize that, yes, there's a lot of functional jobs out there, yes, there's a lot of NGOs, but international development is a great opportunity for you to look at what does that look like for around the world and the types of functions that exist. Net Impact, and of course, internationaljobs.com these are the top 3 sites that I really like to throw out. The idea here with resources is to make sure that you are finding information on the target that you have. If you want to work in Peru, if you want to be in XYZ industry, if you want to work for these types of companies, gather as much information as you can to make sure that you're laying the groundwork effectively, you're preparing yourself effectively, because it comes down to this idea of, do you have the experience? Do you have the personality to be able to do that kind of stuff, or the confidence, if you will? And then do you have a plan of action? Because it takes time to be able to map out a whole global career. And so the final thing I just want to leave you all with, and see if there's any questions from the crowd, is it does take time. It does take a timeline, because you got to think about, one, passport. Sometimes it takes a little while to get that passport. Apparently it's getting much more expensive these days, so act fast before the government charges you more money. Work permits, whether they're here, over there, or otherwise, those are always in flux. And every country has their own little nuances that they require you to do. When I went overseas to Azerbaijan years ago, it was an interesting experience. And so what they did, they said, you need to mail us your passport to the consulate in DC. They do all their magical stuff, and then they mail it back to me. And that was freaky, right? Mailing your passport like that's freaky, but that's their process. And that wasn't it. They had to have special letters from whoever I was doing work with over there. And once I got all that, and I flew to Azerbaijan, Baku, you show up at the airport, and if you didn't know this, but they say, well, you have to also pay a certain amount of money in their currency before you can even get through security. Like exact change. We don't have change for you. We don't accept checks. We don't accept whatever it is. And you have to know these little tiny nuances. And then to get back on the plane to leave the country after your work is done, you have to pay another fee to get into the airport and do all these little tiny ideas. When I traveled to Peru, similar thing, but not as extravagant as Azerbaijan, but they would have a certain fee that you had to pay when you're giving them your ticket to be able to get through customs just to leave. It was like tax, if you will, a country tax sort of idea. These tiny nuances for work permits and travel and understanding, taxes and all that kind of stuff. This is why Going Global exists. This is why you talk to people. This is why you get this information, because you want to make sure that you're prepared. And then finances, it's not cheap to go overseas, right? You got to think through this idea of, all right, there's going to be fees. I'm going to have to pay for flights. Where am I going to live while I'm waiting for my first paycheck or trying to figure that out? How am I going to make sure that I have the right insurance and medical types of things and any kind of country taxes that exist? So the point here is the three things you want to pay attention to if you're looking at a global career is, one, the why. Why do you want to do it? What's your brand? What are you selling? What are you marketing? Two, who are you going after? What's the target? What's the country? What's the geographic area? What are the countries the languages you speak that you want to go after? And three, making sure that you're prepared by having the right resources and the right plan of action and the timeline as well. So let me end with that and see if there's any questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is a question about, if you know a language proficiently, could you be sent to the country or countries of that language? I'm not sure what field that is in, but it could be corporate as well as state or something like that.
Yeah, I would say that if you are proficient or fluent in a particular language, that's a boon, that's a benefit. I mean, I think your first target should be countries that's the language of the land, if you will, because what an employer will see is that if you know that language and the nuances of that language, you're an asset. That's a value add to the company, and if you can couple that with not just the language, but the understanding of the culture, that's even more valuable, right? I speak Spanish, but that doesn't mean I know everything about the Peruvian culture, if you will.
Should they start looking at going global for jobs in those countries where there's languages spoken, or start at a corporation here that might be?
I would do both. So the question was, should I look at going global and find the jobs and internships and apply, or should I look for companies that are in America that might be multinational, if you will, and go that way? Why not do both, right? So you have two lists that are going on, because the ultimate goal, it sounds like from that question, is I want to work overseas. I want to work in this particular country. So you find different routes to get there as well. And one of the biggest job categories that I hear a lot of times from students is teaching English overseas. There are a lot of programs out there. And so I think the biggest advice that I have, and Joe, you might have additional, is do your research on them before you just commit. There's a lot of fly-by-night sorts of outfits that are out there.
All right, the next one, and then we'll go to the audience as well, see if there's any there. I have a question. I have a master's degree in public diplomacy, but have had a hard time securing a job. Is it worth it to try for internships even if they are unpaid? Will I be overqualified?
That's a big question. So my response is, if you're a current student or alumni of UNC Charlotte, come on in and meet with a career coach. Ask for me if you like, Patrick Madsen, and let's talk it through, because when you think about public diplomacy, is that what the major was? That's a broad thing. What does that mean to you? What's your area of focus? That type of idea. And then I would probably want to get a sense of what's been your process to find employment. Maybe there's a couple websites that you're missing. Maybe there's a strategy that you haven't thought of to get to that point. The idea with unpaid internships, I'm not a big fan of unpaid internships, especially this time and age where there's more jobs than people. I think employers, even nonprofits, have something that they can help you with. But I would encourage you to look at fellowships and grants and some of those other things as well.
All right, here's another one from the online audience. With wanting to work internationally, how do you make yourself stand out against international competition?
Yeah, so the future of work is now, and the future of work research shows that there is a global competition, and there will be for a long, long time for talent. And so that means that easy as it might have been 20 years ago, 25 years ago, which means it comes back down to that brand. And when you think about the brand strategy, the biggest thing to your advantage is talking to people, is networking, is building that social capital, is making sure that people know that you exist, because it doesn't matter how many people you know, it's about how many people know you exist out there. And so my advice and all my international work experience has literally come by the people that I meet and the people that they introduce me to, rather than applying online or putting out my resume out there.
Okay, another one. When looking for jobs abroad, how do I make sure my
Good question. I'm not going to be an expert on all the bits and pieces, but that's where you do your homework. So if you understand the visa process for XYZ country, going global, and other websites that are out there, going directly to the consulate or the embassy's website as well, double checking the information. Sometimes the internet is not updated like it should be, and so I might learn something from XYZ website, and then I'm going to do two or three other websites just to cross-verify what I've been learning and what I've been understanding. I like double checking everything, because I don't want to miss that little beat. If I missed the fact that I had to pay money to get into Azerbaijan, I would have been sitting at the airport waiting for the next flight to get out, because they wouldn't let me in the country. So if I didn't know that little tiny thing and then cross-verified it with their particular embassy or consulate, I would have had a problem.
Any questions in the audience? Here.
Got a question? I know you do. Okay, so the micro commercial that I'll put out there while we're letting our panelists come on up. Just remember, for current students and alumni, you have a career center, which means we can deep dig into your ideas and your ambitions for a global career, and making sure that you're planning it out. I would highly, highly encourage you to think about study abroad types of programs and all the great international programs that our colleagues have. Remember, there's a lot of student clubs and organizations that are around international types of things, and to give you that exposure. Those are those bits and pieces that go into your brand, that go into your resume, that gives you stories to talk to employers and people that you might be networking with, to make sure that they realize and they can see you as a potential international career type of employee. So Joe, thank you very much. I'm going to turn over to my colleague Rachel, and I'm going to get out of the picture.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was fantastic. Lots of really great tips. I hope that the audience, both in person and online, enjoyed that. Joe, are you okay with me just getting started?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. One moment, please. Okay. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and just introduce myself really quickly, and then introduce our panelists. So my name is Rachel Leidenheim. I work very closely with Joseph Hoff in the Office of International Programs. I specifically work with planning and implementing inbound programs from abroad. So we host a lot of different groups from various countries around the world. So once again, thank you guys for joining us this evening. We were completely online last year, so it is nice to have a hybrid format this evening. I have the pleasure of moderating the panel tonight, so I hope that you enjoy this. I'm going to take a quick moment to introduce our panelists, and then just give a quick rundown of how it's going to go this evening, and then we'll get started. All right. In person, we do have 3 panelists in person, and then we do have 1 online. So I'll just start with our online panelists. So we have the pleasure of having Ambassador Robert Pearson online with us. He is the former U.S. Ambassador to Turkey and Director General of the Foreign Service. We also have Beth Lorenz with us this evening at the far end. She is the Assistant Director of UNC Charlotte's Education Abroad. Next to Beth, we have Ryan Kern, who is the Senior Experience Designer at Bond Brand Loyalty. And I was also told this evening that he used to work for a Canadian nonprofit, and I'm sure you can share more, called We, and you were the Tanzania country director, if I'm not mistaken. And then last but not least, we have Kelsey Baker, who is an associate attorney at Mayer Brown. Thank you guys so much for taking your time to join us this evening. So how it's going to go, I'm going to give the panelists each a few moments to introduce themselves a little bit in more detail. I do have some questions specific to each of them. And then I have some general questions for them, and anyone can chime in with those general questions. And then I want to open it up to the audience, so both our online folks as well as our in-person. So keep those questions coming once we get to that point. All right, so I can't necessarily see Ambassador Pearson, but I am going to start with you. This is a new format for me too, so this is kind of fun. All right, Ambassador Pearson, what international careers exist within the U.S. government?
Well, first, let me say that I'm delighted to be with you, and I appreciate your flexibility in letting me join you from near Chapel Hill. So delighted to see the audience virtually and be with you, and thank you for the time.
And then we're going to circle back to you, Ambassador Pearson. All right. Okay, Beth, I'm going to start with you.
All right.
All right. How can studying abroad improve career prospects?
So I think how I can approach that is, so study abroad in general has been studied more and more throughout the years. And what they're finding is that students who study abroad, the skills that they demonstrate actually make them highly employable. So when we talk about skills, we're talking about both soft skills, and they also talk about global skills. In fact, I am a member of our professional organization called NAFSA, and they released a report last year about this, about when they studied skills that employers were looking for, and they studied the skills that study abroad students were gaining from their programs, they found that the two were well aligned, and that students who studied abroad were more prepared for the workforce. And they had developed the soft skills such as communication, adaptability, ability to deal with change, global understanding, global interpretation. So these are all skills. I've worked in higher ed for over 20 years. And one thing I've always said to students is, when you go to college, one thing you should always do is, what can I do besides sit in the classroom and learn? There should always be something a little bit more. If you want to get a job, you have to demonstrate, I am ready for the workforce. Obviously, I'm promoting study abroad, but I always say that in general, that you should be thinking about that. But when you study abroad, you are basically transporting yourself from your level of comfort. Everyone has a level of comfort where they are, and they're removing that level, or that bubble, I like to call, and putting themselves in an uncomfortable and difficult situation, which I really think everyone should do. I think it's made me the person that I am. But from that, what you don't realize is you're developing those soft skills, those skills that, you read a resume and it'll say, like, we're looking for this and this and this, but what it's not saying are these soft skills. And those are the skills that study abroad students demonstrate in an interview. It may not be on paper, but when you sit down, you're demonstrating a level of maturity and that what you're prepared to do, what you've done in college to show I've gone above and beyond. So these are the skills that employers really catch their eye. It may not necessarily always be, you can put study abroad on your resume, but when you make it to that interview process, you are demonstrating skills that employers want. In fact, there's more and more studies to show that they're hired more quickly than students who didn't study abroad. They're more likely to go into leadership roles, president roles, CEO roles. So if I could at least encourage you to consider study abroad for those reasons, because there's a difference between I sat in a classroom and I got A's and I did really, really well, versus I had real life immersive experiences.
Thank you, Beth. Yes, I think those soft skills are really important and certainly come from study abroad. All right, so moving to your second question, you have extensive experience with study abroad programs. What do the most rewarding and beneficial study abroad programs have in common?
So what I would say for the most beneficial and rewarding is, I think kind of like college, there's your typical study abroad program. So if you want the most bang for your buck, I usually say study abroad and what I mean by that is study abroad and what else was included. So what I mean by that is, was there an internship opportunity? Was there a host family situation? Did you try to network while you were there? There's lots and lots of different ways. I always say study abroad is on a spectrum. You can have well supported programs, which are really great for students who, I'm really nervous about this. I was that student at one point. I wanted a program that literally was planned out step by step. And then when I got my footing, I wanted a more independent. No, I want to do my own thing. I want to figure this out on my own. And everyone is sort of on this spectrum. right? But what is included? So I think what we're starting to see is some of those short-term programs, which for a while was actually poo-pooed, like, oh, those aren't great. Depending on how they're designed, you can really they have hands-on projects, or you might be networking while you're there, for example, if it's like a business program. So what is included in that program that is getting you out into the community that you are in? And I think that's the main thing you should be looking for. Because there are study abroad programs where you're in a bubble, just like you are in the United States. They're designed for U.S.-based students, and they decide programming for U.S. students. And yeah, they'll introduce you to the culture, and on the weekends you might travel a whole lot. But what can you say that you learned if you do that? If everything you did was created for you, and then on the weekends you did not opt to stay and truly learn about where you are living and about the culture and the community that you're in. So I would say the most successful ones are the ones that have thought through, how am I going to impact the community? What am I going to learn when I am here in this space? I'm not saying you shouldn't travel, because yeah, that's part of the fun part too, is I'm just saying you shouldn't travel all the time, and you should really learn about the place and space that you are in. And what are those opportunities that you can take advantage of? It's more than just, I'm going to go to class in this institution in this country. Are you getting involved on campus with clubs? Are you looking for those little snippets that help you integrate and learn more? I was listening to Patrick earlier, and those little tidbits of what are you actually learning? Because I have encountered students where have studied abroad, and I'm not sure exactly what they learned when they got home. Because at the end of the day, if you only hang out with the U.S. students and you only do things with them and you only travel to the countries with them, how are you getting outside of your comfort zone? How are you learning? How are you adapting? So if you want to get the most bang out of your buck, those are the kind of programs where you look at the itinerary, what's included. Even some of our short-term programs have amazing itineraries where you get to interact with businesses and you get to see, learn about the industry. So look very closely at the itinerary and the inclusions and really try to immerse yourself.
Thank you, Beth. And just a quick reminder, Beth works here on campus,
Oh, I
so
do.
for all of our UNC Charlotte current students, definitely visit the Office of Education Abroad. We're located over in the College of Health and Human Services, and we can provide more information about study abroad if you haven't already. All right, so moving right along, and again, there's going to be opportunity to ask questions to Beth if you have some. I'm going to move along to Ryan. Thank you, Ryan. Your first question. In your experience, what is the best way to improve intercultural competencies and cultural adaptability in the global workforce?
It's a big question, I think. But just going off my experience, so I the day after I graduated, really, and lived abroad up until COVID kind of shut down the world and brought us all back. But overseas, I was able to work for a Canadian-based NGO, or non-governmental organization, a nonprofit, and it also had kind of a travel component to it. And so I would get the opportunity to host short-term trips. We call them service learning trips, but essentially it was traveling abroad, studying abroad, those types of things, but more on a short-term basis. And so I got to sort of watch this happen over and over again with these students on these trips. And I think one of the most important things to do is, one, to surround yourself, with people that are different than you, with people that are from the communities, from the countries that you decide to go to, kind of piggybacking off of what Beth was saying. It's incredibly important to surround yourself with those people. And I think really it's about traveling with intent. So just like you were saying as well, is you don't just travel to travel. You want to go without sort of expectations, but you also want to go with a little bit of intention. And I think a little bit of empathy goes a long way as well when you're traveling. And I guess, what does empathy look like when you're traveling? I think it looks like asking why. And so if you see something is the way it is, ask why. Like, go a level deeper. Understand, why things are the way they are. If there are tensions between two communities or two parties in a different country, or you're interested in the political climate there, you're interested in, the environmental climate there, whatever it may be, start asking those questions and really building up the reasoning and the why behind things are the way they are. And you'll realize that you probably have, when you go back home and you go back to your own town, your own country, you probably have a lot in common with those places, and you probably have a lot that's different. And I think it's all about kind of gaining that experience and getting that knowledge so that you can kind of come back home, whether it's back to school or whether it's trying to find a job or whether it's in a job and with coworkers, but trying to make a little bit of the difference and bring that travel experience into sort of your daily life in that sense.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah.
To follow up on that, how can those interested become involved in working for nonprofit organizations abroad like you did?
Yeah, get out there and look. I think a good way to start looking is sort of reflect on yourself and who you are and what you care about, what your passions are, what drives you as a student, as a person, and then try to find organizations that have similar values to that. It may be in the political world, it may be in the NGO world, it might be a for-profit company or a business, but try to align your values with those values, and if those sort of latch on to each other, you're bound to have a great experience. But at the same time, you're going to gain an experience, and even if it's just a foot in the door, you're going to meet people there. You're going to have experiences there. You're going to, have life experiences outside of the courses you're taking, or, the adventures you may go on, or something like that. And so, it's a foot in the door, just travel in general, I think, in that sense. So really trying to align your values, though, and figure out, okay, who am I? What do I care about? What's important to me? And try to find companies that sort of do that. And if there are volunteer opportunities, that's great. If it's job opportunities, that's awesome too. But it's really about the experience that you're gaining. I think if you're still in school, you're just coming out of school, gaining those experiences, working with people from different backgrounds, from different cultures, from different places that you are, is only gonna sort of make you as an employee, as a person, as a student, like a better form of all of those, I think.
You already said this, my apologies, but how did you connect specifically with the nonprofit that you worked with?
Yeah, it was a really interesting story. I went to a small school outside of Chicago, and I was an athlete my whole life, so I didn't really have the ability or the luxury of doing a semester abroad or traveling abroad. And so I really wanted to, and so I was able to talk to my coach, and he finally let me travel abroad. But he said I had to do it for either for my faith or for my career. I couldn't just go and backpack Europe or something like that. I think this is kind of what we're all in this room for. And so I just started researching and was really having, honestly, a bit of a hard time finding an organization that I really felt like my values aligned. And it was just through casual conversation. It was through telling people and sort of putting it out there that, hey, I'm looking for these types of experiences. I'm looking to travel abroad. And when you put that out there, you put those feelers out there, you never know kind of what's going to come back. And so I had a family member of mine, my grandmother actually, who was involved with an NGO in rural Eastern Africa. And I decided to apply for an internship there and got it, and spent my first summer there after my sophomore year of school. Went back as sort of a seasonal employer after my junior year, and then ultimately moved to Nairobi when I graduated. Yeah.
Great, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right, Kelsey. And my apologies, because I totally said I was going to give you all the opportunity to introduce yourselves in more detail, and then I went right into the question. So, Kelsey, before you answer this next question, feel free to give a little bit more context. But your first question is, how can someone get started in, and what does it mean? I don't know what that, okay, yes. How can someone get started in, and what does it mean to work in immigration law?
Sure. So a little bit about me. I'm an immigration attorney. I work at Mayer Brown, which is a large law firm. How does one get into immigration? Here's how I got into it. I was an international studies and French double major. I went to Queen's University of Charlotte, graduated 10 years ago. So I've been in North Carolina for a long time. And when I graduated, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted it to be international related. International studies and French was really my passion. I took advantage of the study abroad program. I did a language immersion in France. That was the first time I had ever been abroad, and that was pretty life-shaping. And so I just thought, what on earth can I do that's going to allow me to work with international individuals? I was waiting tables when I graduated, and I got an internship with the Mayor's International Cabinet, and that was my first foot in the door to interacting with an international community. I was able to act as a translator for the delegation of our sister city in Limoges, France when they came over, and that was something I never would have been able to take advantage of or have the opportunity to do unless I asked. So honestly, the language immersion, though it wasn't a full semester abroad, it was several months in France, and even just the full immersion of living with the host mother, living in her house, walking to school every day, exactly like Beth said, really immersing yourself in the culture and living as close to a French citizen as I could for as long as I could. That really allowed me to sort of put down the roots and sort of that passion. So it came up an opportunity to work as a paralegal at an immigration law firm. And I thought, I've never thought about being a paralegal before, but I like the word immigration. That's connected to an international community. Let me try it. And I ended up loving it. It was a chance to connect with international individuals, specifically those who were coming over for business, coming over for jobs, temporary work visas. I got to work with them, and after 3 years, I thought, you know what, I love doing what I do, but I feel a little held back by not being able to directly advise these individuals, and that's when I decided to make the jump and go to law school. So I knew going into law school I wanted to do immigration. Nobody could change my mind. But even then, I was able to expand my opportunities in immigration. I worked in the immigration law clinic. I worked on asylum cases. I was able to volunteer in a detention center in Georgia and worked with clients under the Violence Against Women Act. So it was really eye-opening and another way to sort of further the expansion in the waters. So in terms of the original question, how does one get into immigration? There's a lot of ways to get your foot in the door. It can be just starting to work with international clients, starting to work with international companies. A lot of those multinational corporations that Patrick was talking about, they have work visas. They have, managers that come over from different countries. They all need visas. They all, send people abroad. They have various internship opportunities. That's all immigration law. I would say that the focus that I've had in my career, which is maybe the other side of the coin to what Ryan and Beth were talking about, is Charlotte is actually an incredibly international city. I don't think we really fully realize or appreciate what a hub we are for international companies, communities, and there are a lot of ways to get connected. It doesn't have to be just a law firm. It can be volunteering. There's a variety of humanitarian-based immigration organizations that are even in Charlotte. So volunteer on the weekend. Help people study for their citizenship course. That's something that you don't necessarily need foreign language skills for, and it can allow you to directly volunteer with immigrant communities. There's also another way to just start networking. There is a German-American Chamber of Commerce, a French-American Chamber of Commerce. They allow, obviously the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, that's a huge way to get connected. Join the Magellan Society if you haven't. When you get the opportunity to do that, they will start connecting you. And I would say the three biggest words of how do you get into immigration or even in an international career is networking, networking, networking. Just start talking to people.
Wonderful, thank you. And I appreciate you sharing that because I think for some people it might maybe seem a little scary to get started, but you had an interesting path, and I think that's helpful for people to hear that, sometimes you fall into things too, and depending on who you meet and
Absolutely.
what kinds of activities you get involved in. So that was really great to hear. So perhaps you can expand a little bit more. Can you speak to how you gained experience and extracurricular knowledge of the immigration process?
Sure. So firstly, I'll just say that immigration, being an attorney in any field, it's called practicing as an attorney, right? Because you are always practicing. You're practicing and growing, and you're continually gaining skills, and you're continually honing what you know. So it is a lifelong learning path to be a lawyer in whatever field you're in. In terms of how do you gain knowledge, honestly, there are a ton of conferences, there are a ton of panels that are available for a much lower cost for students. If you're interested in doing that, that can give you a lot of opportunities to both network and to understand sort of the ins and outs of what does immigration look like, the corporate business-based side of it or the humanitarian asylum-based side of it. And you can start sort of figuring out which fork in the road do I want? Do I want to try to, touch all of those different areas of immigration law? Conferences are certainly a great way to start. Like I said, World Affairs Council is also a really good way to connect. And honestly, just start searching around. What can you afford to do? What can you, I certainly understand that travel abroad is difficult to come by, and certainly if you have the opportunity to make it financially workable while you're in school, I really encourage you to do that. That's the only way that I was ever able to study abroad in France, was through my university. But there are other ways to start connecting with other individuals who are international and who are in various spots in their own personal immigration journey. You would be really surprised to learn how many individuals who are around you at any given time who are not natural-born U.S. citizens, who have their own, complicated, interesting, colorful, amazing backstory of how they got to be right in front of you in the grocery store, or in the library, or wherever you happen to encounter them.
Thank you, Kelsey. And while not related to immigration law specifically, there are also lots of opportunities here on campus to get involved in the international community here at UNC Charlotte. The Office of International Programs does hold several different events throughout the year. And then there are also programs if you're interested in meeting international students. So just keep that in mind as well. Thank you guys so much for those answers to those specific questions. I do want to circle back to Ambassador Pearson now. Hopefully we have figured out wonderful, yes. Good to see you, Ambassador Pearson. And thank you so much for being here this evening. It looks like you might be on mute, but I do see you.
Well, thank you for letting me be part of this discussion. What I've heard from the panelists thus far, I really completely agree with. I would say that in the audience tonight, practically everyone's interested in the possibility of an international career. And whatever it is that is your chosen specialty in university, there's probably an international component. That wasn't true years ago, but it is true now. The world is shrinking, and you could say the world has shrunk, because we are at a point where one event anywhere in the world affects people everywhere in the world. And so the idea of some sort of artificial division between domestic and international is rapidly disappearing. So if you focus on international work, there are many, many opportunities. I would say for people in the American Foreign Service, it's important to have a sense of adventure, to be really curious about living in a culture other than your own for a good period of time and coping with it successfully. There is a great deal of importance assigned to your understanding of risk. Might not be the risk of violence, it might be the risk of exposure to disease, to environmental conditions, to things that happen in life elsewhere in the world that don't always happen in the United States. So a sense of resilience and confidence that you can deal with those issues, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. A sense of intellectual commitment, so that your role overseas is not to enjoy the culture per se, although we hope that you do, but it is to understand the culture. To people back in Washington who don't live overseas and don't work overseas, the ability of a Foreign Service officer to interpret what's happening overseas in ways that people in Washington will understand is critical. The use of the English language, written and oral, is critical. And finally, I would say that it's a social profession with a apprenticeship approach. So you begin doing jobs that may not be the one you really want to do, but you begin and you learn experiences. Our friend Casey, I think, said about practicing law. That is, you gain experience as you go and you become more competent as you go. In terms of professions, I think the one thing I didn't hear in the discussion was the Peace Corps. In the Foreign Service, I would say 15% of our entrants are Peace Corps veterans. They have understood the culture. They have lived in these places. And if you think about the world, the United States is 5% of the population. If you add Europe, you might get above 10, 11, 12%. But the vast majority of people don't live in those countries, and their cultures and their beliefs and their understandings and their ideas of morality are different from ours. And so the ability to know how to work in those environments is absolutely invaluable. The same is true for lawyers. About 15% of our Foreign Service officers are lawyers. I was a lawyer, and I really wanted to be involved in the give and take of negotiations. So I moved from the practice of law domestically to really negotiations internationally, and that was a source of joy for me for 40 years. When I left the Foreign Service, I came into another profession related to the Foreign Service, and that is as the head of an NGO organization. We worked on education, on media freedom, and on, I would say, civil development. And I was the president of an outfit called IREX, I-R-E-X, for 6 years. And among the more memorable experiences I had was working in Liberia after a 20-year civil war to try to bring the country back together again, and working in Rwanda after the genocide there in the 90s to begin to try to knit that society back together with American perspective and American help. So I would close on this point by simply saying, whatever you're interested in, my guess is there's an international component. Speaking directly to my experience as a Foreign Service officer and as an officer in an NGO, an international humanitarian NGO, I would say that flexibility, intelligence, adaptability, and commitment to resilience are probably 4 essential components of enjoying the career.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearson. You've definitely had a very interesting career. Speaking of the Foreign Service, what does the future of the Foreign Service look like for those interested in becoming a Foreign Service officer?
That's a very good question, because in American culture, diplomacy is not regarded very highly. And yet, everything we've ever gained has been gained ultimately by diplomacy. The diplomats are there before a war begins, and they are there after a war ends in order to be able to build a foundation for going ahead. If you were to go to Wikipedia and type in international treaties or international agreements, you would find that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of agreements that form a kind of, I'll call it a Buckminster Fuller geodome, so that everything above that dome is not permitted, but everything beneath that dome is permitted. So the mere fact that you can read a newspaper in China or Malaysia or India or Poland is due to the fact that there is a pre-existing agreement that makes that possible, that has been agreed to by the international community. If you're thinking about political issues, then the dialogues that go on are all made possible because you can communicate internationally. Agreements refer to disease, they refer to the law of the sea, they refer to the Antarctic region, to the Arctic region. There's almost no area of international life that isn't, in the end, governed by the willingness of countries to come to agreement. And so that's what Foreign Service officers do. At whatever level of responsibility they have, they exercise that responsibility to agree to reach agreement wherever possible. We all know that there are areas in the world where agreement is not possible. In that case, you try to alleviate the situation. You try to deconflict. You try to find ways to protect innocent civilians, as we're seeing in Ukraine right now. But that is the job that you do. And then the last point I think I would make is that diplomacy is a long-term game. You don't solve international problems overnight, especially difficult international problems. Look at Northern Ireland, where the difficulties still remain between the Catholic and the Protestant community. Look at the Middle East, where the standoff between Israel and the Palestinian people still remains unsolved. Look at Yemen, where a long-standing civil war still has not been has not reached the point where understandings can be codified. So if you're a diplomat, you're in it for the long term, and you're in it for the possibility that it may not be immediately successful, but that you can feel proud that you've done something that makes it possible that one day it will be successful.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearson, and I appreciate that perspective on the Foreign Service. All right, so I'm going to move on to some general questions anyone of the panelists can answer, including you, Ambassador Pearson. So our first question here is, what professional skills should job seekers look to develop or strengthen? And just feel free to jump in if you've got a response.
I can probably answer a couple of those. I think the skills I meant when I talked earlier about the soft skills versus, I guess, the hard skills that you see on paper. Some things that I think makes students stand out, because even if I wasn't in the field that I am, these are things that I would look for, is first of all, your communication skills. And I don't necessarily mean do you write well and speak well, but communicate. And I think that's the point of today's panel is, communication, understanding, between, cultures or boundaries. I would also say adaptability. I think sometimes you get into this idea of work is one thing. And I think you said it earlier, Kelsey, like you should never stop learning. And when I encounter someone who refuses to learn and adapt, you're no longer employable to me. I always use this example. My office uses software to process study abroad applications. I did not get a degree in computer science or software engineering or anything, and I was thrown into that. We were literally told, here's the product, build it. And had I said, well, I'm not a computer programmer, we wouldn't be where we are today, where I can now easily process applications. And my point in that story is that you should always be learning whatever field you get into. So it's that adaptability that I am going to continuously, because you should never get complacent in your job, ever, because that is when the job has left you behind. So those are some of the skills that I always try to highlight with students.
Thanks, Beth. Anybody else want to chime in?
I think just your ability to network both yourself and network what you're interested in to other people is critical. You will never know what doors are available to you until you start opening some for yourself. And so, as Beth said, in terms of communication, the ability to communicate and be empathetic and understanding and open to other cultures and individuals, but also the ability to communicate who you are and what you bring to the table is also, I would say, a critical skill to develop.
Wonderful, thank you. Anyone else?
I think I would emphasize 2 points, if I may. One is, and these are both follow-ups to what's been said. Can you hear me okay now?
We can.
Yeah.
Okay, you can? Great. Then I think the first one is what's been suggested as the ability to communicate with your fellows in the Foreign Service, that ability to communicate with each other in a work environment that may be itself isolated somewhere in the world is extremely important, and managing interpersonal relationships so that you are constantly working to find a consensus that is not the lowest common denominator, which takes a lot of effort sometimes, but is very important. And then the second point I would say, which I think is a little bit different today in the Foreign Service, and it might be in other professions, and that is that every day an embassy has to communicate with people in Washington. It might be communicating with 50 different people. If you took COVID, for example, there is an entire gamut of Washington agencies interested in the COVID issue. And so when you send back information, you may be talking to people in a half a dozen or more different agencies. So the ability to write well, and I will apologize for saying this next line, without grammatical mistakes of any kind, is an important tool that the Foreign Service has that helps us manage the policy formation process in Washington. And so that is a skill that may not be true in other groups that are involved in international work, especially if you can talk over an open line with someone in the US about what you're doing. You can certainly talk through the problem. But in the Foreign Service, where you're often dealing with information that is not public, it can't be public at that moment, the ability to write and express yourself in an organized way and with good style and grammar is a really important aspect of becoming a Foreign Service officer.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearson, for emphasizing that. Hopefully everyone got that takeaway. All right, so moving on to the next question. I'm going to combine two because we also had a question come in from when someone registered. So I know that multiple people have mentioned networking and the importance of networking. The question then is, how can folks network with individuals abroad or with organizations abroad while here in the US? What tips or tricks might you have for that?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned before, there are multiple chambers of commerce to start with that have different backgrounds and different groups depending on sort of the home country that they're representing. There's very often events that are open to students as well. You don't have to be a professional in order to participate. And that's a really good way to start to encounter and meet and understand what other companies are around here, what other companies are available to potentially get an internship, potentially get a job once you graduate. What are they looking for? What kind of positions do they have? I think that that's always a good start. And then really just looking around. As Patrick said earlier, you can just start researching and you can understand which companies are multinational, which companies are completely foreign-based, and how you're going to be able to approach them. Do you need to go abroad in order to start communicating with these companies? Or do they have branches in the US where you can start talking with people who work here in the US, potentially aiming for a job transfer abroad at some point in your career? There are several different ways to certainly get your foot in the door, but I would say just start to understand where individuals who work at those companies are located and how you can start talking with them.
Thanks, Kelsey. Anyone else?
Yeah, sure, I'll add something. I think everything that you said, Kelsey, like seeking out those opportunities and finding like physical locations and communities that you can go and network at. I also think that when you're networking, the ability to listen is really underrated as well. We oftentimes want to talk about who we are and why we belong in this room and why we should meet these people. But being able to listen and learn from other people is a skill that is insanely important. And I think it just allows you to, going off of what Beth was saying, communicate a little bit better. Because instead of trying to have this small talk that feels awkward and it feels inauthentic, being able to just sit there and listen to somebody tell a story and ask meaningful questions afterwards is going to make that sort of communication, that interaction, like 10 times more powerful and 10 times more memorable. So if you can think about listening first and then asking questions that like you're genuinely interested in. And also, it can be really intimidating going into these events and being around people that have all these experiences and you look up to them in all these different ways. And just knowing that as a younger person and as somebody that's eager to learn and somebody who's good at listening first, you have the ability of asking really simple questions, of asking for forgiveness and saying, hey, I'm not sure exactly even what a paralegal is. Can you explain like what that is or something? So you're at the age and you're at the experience level where you can beg forgiveness with those questions. But if you show the eagerness and if you show the ability to listen, then I think it only makes people who are successful in that field want to help those people even more.
And I think that Ryan brings up such a good point in terms of listening. So I just want to quickly tack on to that. When I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, I just started reaching out to people who were way above my pay grade, and just said, would you be generous enough with your time? Could I take you to coffee? Could I take you to lunch? And could I just ask you how you got to where you are? Could I just hear your story and understand, what your steps were and what you did? And I was able to have meetings with incredibly interesting and incredibly accomplished people who were more than happy to tell their story and to act as, a pseudo mentor to an individual, a young, inexperienced individual who was just looking for a place to start. And so it can be intimidating to reach out to someone who, is very experienced and extremely accomplished. But to just say, like, would you mind telling me your story? Can I just treat you to lunch and hear what you have to say? That can go a long way, and that can give a lot of insight as to potential opportunities that you didn't know were there before.
That's great. Thank you both. I will just add too that generally speaking, people want to help others. So don't be too intimidated to reach out, like Kelsey said. All right. One more general question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So for those that have gone and gotten a graduate degree, the question is, based on your experience, would you find it more beneficial to attend graduate school before beginning your career, or first get some practical experience and then return to school?
I can give my small piece of advice.
Thank you.
All this is totally based on my experience. I think you can't really go wrong with either way, depending on what I mentioned when I first talked about what are you getting out of that experience. But my one experience, from my experience, I would recommend is don't wait too long. And that's solely because I was miserable in grad school because I waited too long. It is really hard I was working a full-time job and I was part-time in grad school, and that was difficult. And it was me, it was my personality, and I had trouble giving up the freedom I had because I took a very long time to go back to grad school. And I liked the life I had before grad school. So that's always the advice I give to everybody is if grad school is on your horizon, I don't think you can go wrong going either way, either getting some experience and then going, or getting some career or going right into it. But my only advice is just don't wait too long, because you're going to reach a point where I felt settled in my career, but I needed that next step, and it was very difficult for me. So just don't wait too long.
I am so grateful that I decided to work for a few years before I went to graduate school, because I never would have gone to law school if I hadn't fallen into the job of a paralegal and working at a law firm and understanding what that lifestyle was like and what it really took to be an attorney and what the day-to-day looked like, and to understand what I was getting myself into when I decided to make that jump to graduate school. So for that, I'm grateful. Also, to Beth's point, though, I was about 3 years into being a paralegal and decided I got to do this now, or I'm going to get way too comfortable. Like Beth said, I'm going to further my career a little too much to be able to shift this. And so that's when I decided, I've had the experience to now know what I want to go to graduate school for. So now's the time.
I have a comment if I may.
Please, yeah. Ambassador Pearson.
Really just building on what I already heard, I would say that I would opt for practical experience after an undergraduate degree, and again, for not too long. But I would say, as I think Beth had said at the very beginning of our talk, that there's a big difference between trying to get something that will look good on your CV and acquiring a learning experience that will give you skills in life and judgment. So the purpose of the time after undergraduate school is for the second goal, not the first goal. And then when you return to graduate school, you're building on something that gives you a much better perspective of what you're learning in whatever postgraduate study you're taking, and you can leverage that into a career that you feel is more suited to your skills and your experience.
Ryan, you want to add anything?
I'll just add on. I do not have a graduate degree, but I do think I agree with what everybody said here tonight, and I think it really depends on who you are and what you want as well, and what type of person you are. Experience before or after is meaningful, but for example, like I have a brother, and ever since I was born, he was like 3 years old. He knew he wanted to be a police officer. Like, he knew it. He set out to school to do it. That's what he did. That's what he does now. Now he works in the federal space, but he's accomplished those goals. Meanwhile, I grew up having no idea what I wanted to do. And so the way that I kind of view grad school is, undergrad is kind of, you're still figuring out who you are, what you like doing, and what you're passionate about. And then if you're going to go into grad school, I would think that you'd want to have a pretty good idea and a pretty strong passion for what you're going to go into. And so if you're somebody like my brother who's known what they want to do for their whole lives, go and do it. If that's what you think you want to do, go study up on it and get that knowledge and that experience of being in school, and then you're going to have that going forward, looking for a job in the workforce. And if you're more like me, who is kind of all over the place and still figuring out your place in the world, like, go get some experience, but try to have an idea of what you're interested in, and then go get your experience sort of tailored on that idea. And then that's only going to make you more valuable when you go back into those classrooms and you're with all those other students.
Thank you, guys. It was very helpful, very valuable. All right. I'd like to turn it over to everyone who is either online or here in person. We have at least 10 minutes. I'll try to be mindful of time. So if you guys have any questions, please, Joe's going to monitor the chat, because unfortunately I can't access the iPad. And I will manage those here in person.
So we have about 3 questions online. I'll start with those, and then we will move to anyone in person. The first is, this is for Ambassador Pearson. If someone is interested in working in diplomacy, how do they get started? Is the State Department the only route?
That's a very good question. If you want to work in the Foreign Service in diplomacy, then it is the only route. There are colleagues in the Foreign Service who work for the U.S. Agency for International Development, which focus on development in countries that often are emerging economies. But in essence, it is the State Department for working with the structure of the U.S. Foreign Service. But if you are interested in medicine and say disease control, and you want to work for CDC, then you will eventually have an opportunity to work with colleagues in other countries and try to fashion solutions to disease problems that they have. So that, in effect, is doing diplomacy. So the practice of the art is not confined to the U.S. State Department, but the practice of what I'm going to call state-to-state governance and solution settlement issues. What are you going to do with space, with the high seas, with energy? How do you end a war, and so on? Those responsibilities pretty much lie within the State Department. But I wouldn't discourage you if you think that you would like to be involved in international affairs in some way other than the Foreign Service, then I think you should pursue your dream and your interest and see if that is what you'd really like to do.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearson. Here's a question, I think, for everyone, because I think you've all entered the field in multiple ways. As someone that is about to graduate and realize they wanted to enter the international scene too late to study abroad, what are some good first steps to take now, post-grad, to end up there someday?
Yeah, I can jump in. There are tons of websites and online communities that offer workaways or extended stays or culture swaps or house swaps, whatever it may be. Like, there's never been more resources online today than there to help you in that sense. COVID definitely, I think, hurt that industry a lot. But the thirst is there. People want to travel again, and it's definitely going to be an industry that bounces back. But there's tons of resources online. If you just Google any, that you want to study abroad or you want to go abroad and stay somewhere, it's never been easier than it is today, which is the good news. The not so good news is that you still have to go out and seek those opportunities. They're not going to come to you, right? And it's not just a quick Google search and a quick application and do it. Like, you want to put some research and some effort in. But the ability to do that has never been more convenient, for sure. I don't know if you would agree with me.
No, yeah, I would. I mean, for my purposes in my office, we actually have a website dedicated to our students who are about to graduate. We have an alumni section where we give you some resources. Some common things that I've seen. I know a lot of people in my industry have start with teaching abroad positions. It's a great way. Obviously, you would get paid. You have to like to teach because you're usually teaching English. Usually these are long-term positions, and what I mean by that is they're usually at least a year. So it's at least 1 year commitment to extend. And so that's a great way to, once you finish, if you just want to have that immersive experience. And a lot of these positions, because you're teaching English, some of them don't necessarily require, the TESOL degree. They'll train you. And so I know there's even some short-term opportunities. I can recall a woman I used to work with who used to do this for fun over the summer. She'd go teach English for 2 months. So there's opportunities like that that you can kind of look for those work experiences. But yeah, we have lots of websites on the Education Abroad website for those actually specific things. Like I think the fun one I think it's called woofing, where you work on a farm. Like even like fun little things like that. There's all of these opportunities. You just kind of have to like really dig in and research.
Yeah, I would like to second the teaching abroad idea, because it really does make it possible to learn something about the culture, even though you do spend a lot of your time in your native language. You make friends and you understand the culture. And obviously, it's really important to go to a culture that is exotic. So Korea or Japan or Thailand, or one of the Latin American countries, or China. Go somewhere where you are going to be dealing with a culture that you've never anticipated before, instead of finding something sort of in between. And I would also say that the Peace Corps remains an incredible learning tool for understanding what it's like to live abroad and to manage abroad. And I mentioned the number of people who come out of the Peace Corps and go into the Foreign Service, and we are delighted with them. And then the final point I would make is that NGOs are a practice ground as well for learning with other cultures. And sometimes they recruit specifically for countries where English is the language being used, but the native people speak other languages, but the problems still have to be resolved. So that's another way of getting experience without having to make a lifetime commitment.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador Pearson. I do want to give an opportunity to our folks in the room as well. So do any of you have questions? Yes, in the back, please.
Do we have time for two, or should I just pick one?
Maybe pick your favorite.
Okay. Hi, my name's Maya, and as I've started taking classes about international studies and understanding the politics of the world, I have found it a little bit bleak, and honestly, sometimes unfortunate, and a little bit cup half empty. I was wondering, for everyone or whoever, how do you know that you're participating in something that is going to help the world rather than hurt it?
Yeah, wow, great question.
That's a great question.
I would say, as an immigration attorney, there are some, we'll say, good days and bad days in the profession. Things can change a lot based on political administrations, and there can be ebbs and flows in terms of policies that can really change things very quickly. I think for me, a consistent reminder in my practice that I'm doing good for the world is really, I really get to be able to focus on I'd say on a more individual basis. When I'm able to, assist a family to be able to stay here, to further their career so that they can, accomplish the dreams that they have set forth for themselves personally, to come here for school, to be able to find a job afterwards, to be able to stay in the United States, to have American citizen children that are born here, because that's something that they want and that they've worked very, very hard for. To me, that is the most rewarding part of the job, right? I know that we, can have various thoughts on what it means to really live the American dream or what that definition really even is. But for certainly the immigrant population, it's a very real thing. It's a very real goal that a lot of people work very, very hard and sometimes wait their whole lives to be able to achieve. And so if zooming out seems a little bleak, for me, it's more helpful to zoom in and to be able to really, understand on a person-to-person basis that you're helping another human and you're interacting with another human and helping them achieve their goal.
I think from my lens, exactly what you just said. So when you zoom out, it can seem very bleak. But when you zoom in, and I guess this is from my perspective of what I wish students would get out of study abroad, it is the zoom in. I have studied abroad in places that were difficult to swallow, and that you are wondering, you're just questioning everything because of what you're seeing. But when you really, really dig in and understand a culture, that's, I think, when you have that realization of how you can help. And I think there's a really simple story my boss always tells that I think sort of explains what I'm trying to, I don't think, articulately say, is there was a car that was created. It was the Nova, and it was sold in Mexico, and it didn't sell. If you know Spanish, you know why. That means no go. Somebody didn't do their research. Someone didn't understand. So I guess that's my point is when you get into a place and a space, even though it seems bleak, try to understand it first. Because at the end of the day, the bleakest places I have been to, there is something beautiful and wonderful about that space. And even the smallest bit of change can help. But you can't, I think that's the point of why I'm so passionate about study abroad, is that you can't inject your ideals into another culture. And so you have to understand them. And then that's when you can interject change. Is not what I want you to do. It's I need to start from the ground up, from how you understand things.
I would like to just add a couple of comments. One is I'm probably in the negative category here, so I'll try to show what can be done from the position of trying to help people when you're talking about general issues. But on the specifics, maybe you're more interested in the U.S. Agency for International Development if you're thinking about government work, but they do enormously good work in lots of countries at the micro and macro level. But from my standpoint, my first assignment was in New Zealand. So I was the officer assigned to the Maori and South Pacific Islander affairs. I learned a lot, and I think they learned a lot about America's interest in them and in their role in New Zealand society. I also worked with the anti-nuclear groups in New Zealand, not to try to change them so much as to try to understand them and have them understand us. My wife worked in China with the Chinese film industry, not to make them change their minds, but to show them films from the United States that evoked themes that the Chinese appreciated. And Coal Miner's Daughter was a film that the Chinese loved, and on Golden Pond. I know these are old films because this was the 1980s, but that was a way of getting to the Chinese in a way that showed the best of what America could do. So I appreciate your interest in the detail and in the immediate, and I don't criticize it at all. But there are ways to make small changes that have great leverage in other ways as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add on because I think it is important. Your question's a really good one. Coming from like the non-for-profit space, I was responsible for a program which brought North Americans into rural indigenous communities week after week after week. And so I had to weigh that very question all the time. You know, what's happening? Is this all for something of the greater good? Are we really making a purpose here? Are we really making a change? Now, we had projects based around education and helping to sort of remove barriers around education. So the good news is it was right there in front of us. Yes, we are making a difference in these communities, in these people's lives, and it's those stories that I think are what hold true to you, and it's those lived experiences that you'll keep as you travel. But I also think that change and progress is messy, and there might be things that are not so productive, and there might be things that are very productive that come out of it. And so I think it's being okay knowing that there are certain things that might not be so good and might be considered more good. But if we didn't take that chance, if we didn't do those things, then people that were coming and visiting weren't leaving with those stories of those people whose lives they were helping to change. And most times people thought that they were coming to help, and they actually realized that they were leaving learning something from people that were there. And so, and that kind of gets into a whole charity versus social justice discussion. But I do think that just being okay knowing that some things will pan out really well and other things might fall flat, but that's okay. You got to try. You kind of have to fail forward a little bit in that sense, and just knowing that that might happen is okay. But being able to really not only people talk about actions speaking louder than words, but I also think that intent speaks louder than actions, because oftentimes we do mess up. We do have errors that we have, but it's the intent behind those errors. And so how can you kind of course correct to get back on that intention and start to sort of manifest that intention in your actions? I think is sort of the key. Mm.
All right, I believe we have a question in the back. All
Yeah,
right.
I do. So sort of a preliminary question for Kelsey Baker before I go into my questions. What is your preferred title?
Oh, you mean is it Esquire or not?
Yes, sort of.
I mean, I just use, attorney. When I feel like getting really fancy, I put Esquire at the end of it, but that's really just to look cool on business cards.
Okay, so yeah, Attorney Baker, I think that this question you could best answer. Maybe Ambassador Pearson could have good insight as well, but I'm very glad that you're both here. For me, because I'm a Spanish major at this university, but I'm also interested in practicing law. So I know you mentioned talking to people who are experienced in your desired career field, but I wanted to sort of add a follow-up question. So what resources did you specifically utilize to find a program that helped you combine studying law and preparing for a career in foreign service?
Ambassador Pearson, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you. I had a general career. I was a political science major, economics minor. I studied abroad in France, and that's what really gave me an impetus to try to be involved with the world. And I went to law school because I had been interested in law, and I'm very interested and was always very interested in the art of negotiation and persuading people to find a common space to solve problems. So those were the interests that drove me to try out for the Foreign Service. And then I would say, I'm not quite sure if this was your question as well, but a broad general understanding of American history and culture in its largest dimension, from race relations to art and theater, is very important, because as a Foreign Service officer, whatever your job title is, you are a representative of the entire country, I will say good and bad, and that your ability to understand what motivates Americans and is important to Americans is part and parcel of understanding what's important to the people you're talking to and being able to relate those back to the American people.
Yeah, I would also say the fact that you're a Spanish major, you're already well on your way to, being able to challenge yourself to acquire the skills of learning something very new and, no pun intended, very foreign. And in order to, you don't need a paralegal degree to be a paralegal. I'd say that you really, more than anything, you need attention to detail. As Ambassador Pearson said before, you need excellent writing skills with no grammatical errors, because one error on a form can get it rejected by the government. That's pretty important. And to be able to, I think, see what are your biggest strengths, right? Not just, yes, you have this Spanish major, but what other skills do you have? What other skills can you utilize? What other skills do you need to develop a little bit more? And I think focusing on honing those particular skills is going to best prepare you. In terms of if you're interested in law specifically, there is a gamut of majors that end up going to law school, from biology, psychology, international studies, pre-law, history, English. It doesn't take a pre-law degree to go to law school either. It takes attention to detail. It takes a willingness to know what you're getting into, and a drive to do the hard work, and a passion for wanting to advocate for others, whether it's through negotiation, like Ambassador Pearson mentioned, whether it's wanting to advise clients. It's really just the desire to want to fight on behalf of somebody for something that they want.
All right, unfortunately, the time has come. This is my third year moderating this panel, and the hour always goes very fast. However, I want to be very mindful of the panelists' time, but if you have a few minutes to stay after Ambassador Pearson, I don't know, I'll leave that up to you. Perhaps some of you might want to ask a few additional questions. I do want to thank you guys, all of you, all four of you, for taking the time and being with us this evening and for providing all of the wonderful information that you have, sharing your stories. I think that's a big part of this, is just hearing how other people have gotten to these places. So really a big thank you. I do have a small gift for you, which I will give after. And I do want to turn it over real quick to Noah, who works for the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, and she wants to share a little bit more as well about upcoming events.
All right, thank you guys for coming out. Thank you so much to Dr. Patrick Madsen for hosting our Targeting International Career Workshop earlier today. And I want to thank Beth, Ryan, Kelsey, Rachel, and Ambassador Pearson for being on our panel tonight. It was a pleasure. So I just want to also thank the OIP staff and the WAC team for helping us put all of this together. And I just want to tell you about our next upcoming program. On May 10th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Free Range Brewing, we'll have the second in our Drink About It series, which will be on climate change. We'll have representatives from Arrival, Sustain Charlotte, and Duke Energy. And if you're interested in seeing what the World Affairs Council of Charlotte's up with, or YPWAC, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Meetup. And once again, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are dismissed.
Thank you all very much. It was a pleasure and an honor to be with you tonight.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearson, for taking the time.
Take care.